The news from Ireland is still dire. Cork is the county where famine and sickness reign the most cruelly. Immigration from the British Isles, and from Ireland in particular towards this continent, is readying on a vast scale. It's not unlikely that in 1847, Ireland will spill out towards America 200,000 to 300,000 of its people. All the large cities are getting some relief. The people of the interior are enduring worse sufferings. Hundreds of unfortunates die slowly each day of starvation, of dysentery, or of fevers resulting from insufficient food. And the reports coming from the counties farthest from the markets forecast an even more terrible state of affairs.
The Great Irish Famine, known as An Gcuirte Mór in the Irish language, was a watershed moment in Irish history, provoking permanent demographic, social, political, and cultural change. The famine began in 1845 with a blight that caused the repeated failure of Ireland's potato crop. It lasted 5 years and resulted in the deaths of 1 million Irish and the departure of 2 million, who emigrated to Britain, North America, and Australia. By far the worst year was 1847. By the end of the famine, 2 million Irish had left Ireland. For the colonies that made up what is now Canada, the summer of 1847 brought an unprecedented number of newcomers. Their poverty and medical distress tested the limits of the rudimentary medical and charitable structures in place at the local level, and radically changed the demographics of many communities.
Irish immigration has been ongoing for many centuries. When people were emigrating to Canada specifically, their first stop of quarantine was often at Grosse-Île, which is just outside of Quebec City, and their second stop, if they were continuing westward, so towards Toronto and Kingston, they would have to stop here in Montreal.
For those bound for the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, their first port of call was Grosse-Île, the quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River. The island signalled the end of what had been a long and arduous journey and the beginning of their lives in North America. But for some, Grosse-Île was their final resting place.
The summer of 1847 was the most tragic summer that we lived as a quarantine station because of the overwhelming arrival of Irish immigrants fleeing the Irish famine. We were used to receive between 25,000 persons, 30,000 persons per summer, but during Black 47 we received nearly 100,000 persons. It took less than a week before we reached our maximum capacity.
Sir, in submitting for the information of His Excellency the Governor General the report for the sick of the week ending Saturday the 22nd, I regret to have to call to attention to a state of illness and distress among the newly arrived immigrants, unprecedented in this country even during the prevalence of cholera in 1832 and 1834. Every vessel bringing Irish passengers has lost many by fever and dysentery on the voyage, and has arrived here with numbers of sick. Since I have had the honor of addressing you, 17 vessels have arrived with Irish passengers, 5 from Cork, 4 from Liverpool, and the others from Sligo, Limerick, Belfast, Londonderry, and New Ross. Out of these, the large number of 260 have died on the passage, and upwards of 700 have been admitted to hospital, or are being treated on board their vessel, awaiting vacancies to be landed.
The disease we were fighting during Black 47 is called typhus. Typhus was endemic to Ireland, so it means that it was pretty common to have local epidemic of typhus. But during the Irish famine, it was generalized, and those immigrants were embarking on sailing ship. They were sleeping next to one another. They didn't have access to any hygienic installation, and most of the time they were malnourished. A lot of the Irish immigrants would die directly on the sailing ship. That's why we call those ships coffin ship. At first, only the western sector was opened as a quarantine station, so all the installations were there. And since we didn't have enough space to build new shelters, we decided to open the eastern sector, and we ordered tents to accommodate 10,000 persons. The living conditions inside the tents were not that great. People were sleeping near the floor. It was really warm inside those tents. So that's why the authorities decided to order the 12 lazarettos. The objective was to provide a roof and a beds for as many immigrants as possible. Each lazaretto were meant to receive 300 persons each. So that's why we installed long beds that were coming from one end to the other ends of the building, and people were sleeping next one to another. So it wasn't really comfortable either, but it was better than staying outside in the tents.
Despite the hardships of the Atlantic crossing, typhus and starvation, the majority of Irish famine emigrants survived the ocean voyage, passed through quarantine at Gros Isle, and began their trek west from Quebec to Montreal.
Once they arrived on the coffin ships to Gros Isle, disembarked, did the quarantine, there would have been a barge that would have transferred them. So the barge would have been pulled by steamships. The barges were crowded, almost as crowded as the coffin ships were.
So the story in Montreal in 1847 is that you've got sort of two groups that are coordinating the reception of Irish famine immigrants that summer. And Montreal, is absolutely overwhelmed. It's the first stop after Gros Isle for most of the famine immigrants. Many of them are moving on, but nevertheless they need help. It's the Grey Nuns who are the first on the scene and who work tirelessly to look after Irish famine immigrants, to treat them. Inevitably, members of the Grey Nuns, they fall sick and some die.
We have to understand that in those days they didn't know how people got typhus. It was a mystery, and they were risking their own lives. They're literally cutting off filthy clothes, shaving their heads and cleaning them. It's all they can do for them.
Montreal's Board of Health, along with some influential citizens, insisted that the immigrants be treated on an island offshore. Instead, Mayor John Easton Mills ordered additional sheds to be built on the riverbank at Point St. Charles. Mayor Easton Mills visited the sheds frequently to offer what assistance he could. In November of 1847, Mills died after contracting typhus.
At the highest point in 1847, there were over 20 different fever sheds that were on the foot of the Victoria Bridge. In one summer alone, they saw 6,000 people die in those fever sheds, and another 11,000 were treated at the general hospital nearby.
Some of these immigrants actually make it to what was then Bytown, nowadays Ottawa. They'll probably be going there because they have relatives who have settled in the Ottawa and Gatineau valleys. The population of Bytown then was maybe 5,000. You've got at least 4,000 immigrants arriving in July 1847. And they're looked after by Sister Bruyere, a nun from Montreal, one of the Grey Nuns, with a young group of sisters, some of them teenagers, some of them Irish.
1847 in Canada, in Canada East or Canada West, we just don't have the medical infrastructure to accommodate such a huge number of sick people, and it's almost inevitable that the church would take up that task. And they were obviously very instrumental in looking after orphans and finding them placements in homes.
Black 47 left hundreds of children orphans, and they were adopted by Francophone family of the region.
The process would be to find families in the area in Canada East, or some actually ended up in Canada West. The idea was to find families who were willing to take in orphans, and usually they were placed with families that wanted agricultural labor, and but that wasn't always the case. Some children were placed in urban families, but for the most part, it was often as an indentured servant, and so the family would promise the child room and board, clothing, all the necessaries of life, and then a lump sum payment once the child reached the age of majority.
So they literally would take in these Irish travellers who had crossed the Atlantic in horrendous conditions, had been barged either up the Rideau Canal or up the Ottawa River, are in a horrendous state. But the overwhelming response of the Canadians is to try to look after them, even though the numbers are overwhelming.
The transportation of immigrants down the St. Lawrence and along the north shore of Lake Ontario was a significant expense for the Canadian government. The transportation by barge and steamship and by wagon on shore moved immigrants closer to their intended destinations, where they could find work and be reunited with their friends and family. Many famine immigrants disembarked in Toronto.
Like Montreal, Kingston, and the other cities, Toronto received a disproportionate number of Irish famine immigrants to its population. So in 1847, Toronto had a population of 20,000 people, but it received close to 38,000, so almost double its population, and that's unfathomable. You can't even imagine living in Toronto in the 21st century, what that would look like. And so because Toronto was almost the end of the line, you were receiving people who have survived that Atlantic voyage, and thankfully being a larger city than some of the other cities in the province at the time, Toronto had a small hospital, the Toronto General Hospital. And so in June of that year, they repurposed the hospital as an immigrant hospital, and immigrants were transferred there. I think there was about 100 beds in the hospital, but it was at capacity from the start. And as a result, they had to build sheds, almost 10 to 14 of them, on the grounds of the hospital in order to accommodate the overflow. And there are still accounts in the newspapers of immigrants sleeping on the grass outside the hospital because of the volume of patients that were being treated there.
The resources of the city were strained in the extreme to come to the aid of these individuals. A number of the doctors, Dr. Grissett, Dr. Hamilton, the nurses, hospital orderlies, the triage officer, the first Catholic bishop of the city, all lost their lives. I mean, they volunteered to help these people. And it was the largest single loss of life since the history of the city began. It seemed that it would be incorrect and unjust for a man of George Robert Grissett's courage to remain lost to memory. The issue for me with Canada was that it's always an untold story, because when the Irish look out on the Atlantic, they see the stars and stripes on the waves of the Atlantic. They don't see the maple leaf. And it's been my life's work to try and change that. Toronto has a memorial to those who came, as well as a memorial to those who came to their aid and helped them.
Originally envisioned as a reciprocal space to Ireland's departure series of Rowan Gillespie sculptures on Dublin's waterfront, Ireland Park in Toronto was conceived as a public park with sculptures of limestone glass as well as bronze. Rowan Gillespie's 5 bronze sculptures each tell their own story and help to impart onto the visitor a sense of the suffering experienced by Irish migrants while they made their fateful journey across the Atlantic.
The names and the identities of these famine migrants had been lost for 160 years. In fact, when we began the journey, we only had the names of 32 men, women and children who were buried in January or later 1848 in the Catholic Archdiocese. So there are now 14 limestone columns in the park.
Inscribed within these columns are 675 names of those who perished upon arrival, as well as Canadians who came to their aid.
So upon the completion of Ireland Park, I felt that the opportunity to tell the story of Dr. Grissett was a logical extension of what we started with Ireland Park. Grissett Park is an artistic commemoration of the city in the summer of 1847. I think if we are to celebrate people through public art and public places. They need to be of the stature of men and women like Dr. Grissett and Dr. Hamilton and Susan Bailey and Sarah Duggan and all the others who volunteered and lost their lives.
In Kingston, the story's a little bit different. Kingston was a city of 10,000 people in 1847. 50,000 Irish arrived. 50,000 Irish. They were arriving at a rate of 2,500 a week. Kingston's an interesting spot because it's sort of the nexus of the Rideau Canal, the St. Lawrence, and then all the traffic that would have gone up the Great Lakes from here. Some wanted them quarantined on one of the islands in the St. Lawrence / Lake Ontario. And eventually they ended up being quarantined at the foot of Emily Street and King Street here in Kingston. And there were fever sheds there. And they were remarkably close to regular residential area.
Mr. Editor, permit me to bring under the notice of the proper authorities through your columns the impropriety of landing immigrants on Mr. Smith's new wharf at the foot of Queen Street. There, those poor unfortunates are hurried from the barges as they arrive, with scarcely a foothold to secure them from falling into the water and drowning. Last night, one of them fell off the wharf and was with difficulty saved. 'Tis impossible that they can sleep without danger of losing their lives. And as to being able to cook or otherwise obtain comfort while there, the thing is out of the question. Humanity depends that their condition should be looked to at once. Yours respectfully, an observer.
We have discovered, analyzed, and removed all the remaining bodies that were in the mass burial at Kingston Hospital. In total, there were 53 that we can clearly relate to the 1847-1848 Irish burials. Of those, there are about 8 women that we can identify for sure, 10 men that we can identify. There's 25 children under the age of 20. 14 of them are under the age of 5, and the youngest being 3 to 6 months old. So it's a very interesting and heart-wrenching population sample of the immigrants that were coming in. And when you think of a mass burial, you think, okay, they're just wrapping them up and placing them in. They put care. Each one of those bodies was in their own coffin, in a single layer. Wonderfully done coffins, in the classic pinch-toe coffins that you see. We were not expecting that at all. We were expecting, body after body lined up in a row. Somebody was paying for those, somebody was building those, somebody put care into that. So they did have dignity when they were buried. To a certain degree, there was some dignity.
We have a common grave of 300 Irish who died in the summer of 1847 in Bytown, Ottawa. And it's only this summer that we rediscovered the existence of this mass grave.
We have a mass grave on Grosse-Île. Most of the people that died during Black 47 were buried there. Each person had their coffin, so a really simple coffin, and we installed them in the mass grave, up to 3 coffin high, 2 coffin large. And when the grave was filled, we had a ceremony celebrated by a Catholic priest for everyone at the same time. We decided this summer to install brand new crosses, 47, to commemorate 1847. They were made of oak tree, and we decided to install at the head of each row a Celtic cross. So it has more symbolics that way.
We have the Black Rock that commemorates typhus. In terms of the Montreal Irish community and their commemoration, right now the Black Rock is in the middle of Bridge Street, which has 2 ways of traffic on going towards and from the bridge of the Victoria. And the generalized sentiment within the Montreal Irish community is that's not good enough space to be honoring the people who come here, who passed away from typhus in the fever sheds at Goose Village. It's just not the right spot. So working with the different governments, they're looking to create a space that's safe for people to go and visit and pay homage to, and at the same time, another space that can help people learn more about the Irish contributions. in Montreal.
I think that's a very important story when you're dealing with migration stories, because people leave because of famine or because of war or because of discrimination or racism. Most of them came out of necessity to save their lives. And so I thought it was very important that both sides of the story be told.
I think one of the projects we do need to undertake is to tell that story, remember the dead, but also remember the fact that the Irish proved to be very resilient, and through Canada were able to re-establish themselves and create new lives for themselves.
To start and to be clear, this is not a motion to celebrate Irish ancestry as we do on March 17th. Rather, it's a motion to recognize the many contributions that Canadians of Irish descent have made in building this country into what it is today. It is to ask the Parliament of Canada to say thank you and to recognize how much they have contributed. Mr. Speaker, this is not to say they don't know, but it is to say that while making these contributions, the Irish community has displayed a level of modesty that I wish to recognize and to say thank you. They carry the pride of knowing how much they have contributed. Well, I want them to know that we know it too, Madam Speaker.
In the face of famine, disease, and uncertainty, over 100,000 Irish left their homes in 1847 in hopes they would find a better life for themselves and their families in what is now known as Canada. Many perished, but despite the impossible odds, 80% survived the journey and began new lives.
So it's a story about resilience as well, and the welcome that was afforded to the Irish in Canada.
Eventually, they settled in towns and cities across the country. They became the largest ethnic group in almost every city in Canada. They became the working class citizens.
It wasn't always easy. They faced challenges as all newcomers do. These challenges were racial, religious, and economic, but they persevered, Madam Speaker. It's a testament to their strength and values. There's no shortage of evidence in every province and every town.
They made significant contributions to Canada as farmers, politicians, business people, artists, and members of the clergy. The long-range implications of the Great Irish Famine have been studied by historians, archaeologists, and sociologists around the world.
Because there's so many lessons buried in there, so many ways to think about empathy and sympathy for migrants now, and how do we apply the lessons that happened in 1847 to humanitarian crises across the world now.
We have never known a time in human history when so many people have been moving around the world. Understanding, appreciating, and responding graciously and generously to migrants is made easier when one understands the role that Irish migration had in the history of Canada and for the people of Ireland.